When I was still a teenager, my mother sent me packing from our home, so she could devote her time and resources to the new family she had created with her husband. At the time, I tried my best to remain stoic, but the emotional blow was devastating. Fast forward many years, and I found some measure of success in my professional life. That success, strangely enough, seemed to lure her back into my orbit. She appeared at my doorstep one day, insisting that I pay for my half-siblings' college costs. I was stunned to see her after all our time apart, and when I outright refused her demands that felt profoundly unjust, given the circumstances, she flew into a rage and even struck me. Let me go back to the start to unravel everything that led to this intense confrontation. My mother was only 20 years old when she had me. My biological father was never around. She said he didn't want kids, and because they'd only been together a few months, she let him walk away. According to her, the breakup was nasty, so she chose not to go for child support, and he showed no willingness to pitch in any way. They both basically agreed never to speak again. Thankfully, my maternal grandparents offered crucial support, and thanks to them, my mother was able to finish her schooling and secure a stable job. During my early childhood, she dated a handful of men, but none of those relationships were particularly serious. Then, when I was around 8, she started dating Harry, a former co-worker, and they were together for about 3 years before getting married. As for me and Harry, we got along decently, no strong bond, yet no animosity either, just a neutral coexistence under one roof. Roughly 4 years into my mom and Harry's marriage, she got pregnant with twins, which filled the household with excitement and anticipation, myself included. In hindsight, I should have recognized the signs of what might happen in the long run, but I was too focused on believing my mother would always have my back. She had faced plenty of hardships raising me on her own, and it seemed unthinkable that she'd just give me up. True, she and I had started drifting apart. She made it perfectly clear that her focus and energy lay elsewhere after her marriage, but I convinced myself this was only temporary. I really wanted to support her during her pregnancy, but she was on edge whenever I was near, so I tried to keep a low profile. Apparently, I didn't keep low enough, because when the twins were about 6 months old, she and Harry called me in for a serious chat I never saw coming. They announced that they no longer wanted me under their roof. Caring for 2 infants left them with no room, or so they claimed, for a teenager. I was just 16 at the time. I knew they couldn't simply throw me out legally, so they tried a more subtle approach by complaining about their limited income, and how they couldn't support all of us. It seemed ridiculous, because 2 web developers taking care of 2 adults, 1 teen, and 2 babies had so far provided a comfortable life. I was convinced they were exaggerating just to get me out. Even so, I offered to pitch in financially and get a job, but my mother bluntly said she wanted to save everything for the little ones who deserved it more than I did. When she used the word deserved, I knew for certain my place in that household had evaporated. They didn't even bother to suggest where I should go or how I might manage. They just nudged me in a direction, banking on the fact that my pride would keep me from fighting a losing battle. Technically, they never shouted, "Get out right this second," but it felt identical to a formal eviction. I had no other choice, so I packed up and went straight to my grandparents' home. My grandparents were outraged by my mother's behavior, but couldn't bring themselves to completely cut her off, mainly because of the twins. They were getting older and couldn't offer me much in the way of financial help, so at 16, I had to secure a part-time job. Every so often, I saw my mother and Harry at my grandparents' place, but our interactions were stilted and cold. They asked very little about me, and they actually seemed happier without me around. My mother, in particular, seemed way less stressed now that I was gone, which tore me up inside. Still, I had no power to change any of it. I stayed with my grandparents until I left for college. Even then, my mother kept me at arm's length, offering no help. A few good friends stepped up to help me settle into my dorm, because my grandparents weren't in any shape to do the heavy lifting, and I was on my own when it came to paying for school. My mother and Harry refused to co-sign my student loans, falling back on the same tired explanation: they had to save their resources for the twins' future. I had one saving grace: an uncle who kindly co-signed for me as long as I promised I would never default and force him to pay my debts. Throughout college, I balanced work and study to cover both living expenses and my loan payments, so that I wouldn't drag him down with me. By graduation, I was proud of my independence, but my mother's absence still stung. My grandparents were the only ones at the ceremony. She didn't even bother to say congratulations. Once college was done, I took a modest position with a salary just big enough to handle rent, bills, and groceries, plus chip away at my student loans a bit. It was stressful, to say the least, but I wanted to stand on my own 2 feet, and refused to be a burden on my aging grandparents. I didn't even entertain the thought of asking my mother for support. Over time, through determination and hard work, I advanced in my company. It was a long uphill climb, but eventually, I secured a better paying role. I felt especially proud, because I had accomplished it largely on my own. Now I'm in my early 30s, and 4 months ago, I was promoted into an important leadership position. Not many people were in on the news, but I made sure to tell my uncle as a gesture of gratitude. After all, he had taken a leap of faith by co-signing my loan all those years ago, and without him, none of this might have happened. Without my knowledge, my uncle bumped into my mother and Harry at a family gathering. Possibly thinking he was doing a good deed, he updated them on my life and mentioned the promotion, encouraging them to get in touch and congratulate me. Clearly, the idea blew up in his face, because they suddenly materialized at my home, insisting on talking. Since I'd cut ties with my mother once I went to college, seeing no purpose in waiting for apologies that were never going to come, I'd blocked her on every channel. She never tried to reach me, so I assumed she was content to forget I even existed. Her abrupt appearance left me off balance, but I allowed her and Harry inside, naively hoping maybe they'd come to make amends. They immediately began to question why I had told them nothing about my promotion, going on and on about how they had expected more from me. It was nearly comical how they seemed shocked that I wouldn't volunteer personal updates to the people who effectively pushed me out of their lives. They lectured me on how they felt upset and disappointed that I distanced myself simply because they focused all their attention and finances on the twins, believing I was old enough to manage without them. They spun it as if I'd been immature for failing to understand their changed priorities. It was infuriating to see how they twisted the entire story, recasting me as the villain. They refused to let me speak and jumped right to their own troubles. Their business venture had collapsed, leaving them saddled with debt. With the twins now nearing college age, they needed a considerable sum of money and fast. As they continued, I realized they expected me to pay for the twins' education. Their nerve was astonishing. They tried to couch their request in a tone of, "We were offended you didn't reach out, but you can fix this by financing your siblings' schooling." It was almost as if they were gracing me with the privilege of paying off their bills. I lost it. I calmly but firmly spelled out that I wouldn't be assisting them in any way, especially not monetarily, and I felt insulted by their audacious attempts at manipulation. I reminded them of how I had had to work multiple jobs during college, burdening myself with loans, all because they had rejected me and refused to help. I had never tried to guilt-trip them for choosing the twins over me, but they had no right to come around now demanding a bailout when they'd shown no compassion in the past. They quickly got defensive, berating me for dismissing the sacrifices my mother had made when I was younger, acting like I was in perpetual debt to her. They argued that my mom had only requested, this one time, to put other people ahead of me, i.e., the twins, and that I should be considerate of her struggle, given all she had done in the past. In their words, by saying no, I was turning into the same uncaring person they had been accused of being. I found it outrageous to claim I owed my mother infinite gratitude for raising me. At the time I was a child, so who else could I have relied on for food, clothing, and shelter? And as soon as they considered me old enough not to be a burden, they pushed me out. So to me, it was absurd to think I should be eternally grateful for the bare minimum they did when I had no other options as a kid. Finally, I told them to go, or I would call the authorities. They exploded with more insults, but at least it got them out of my house. My mother, on her way out, still yelled about how she had given up so much for me, and that I should return the favor by supporting the twins. She acted as though I had turned her into the villain. After they left, I felt rattled and started second-guessing my position. Was I in the wrong for not contributing now that she was in dire need? Did I expect too much from her during my teenage years? But deep down, it felt like manipulation. Just to be certain, I turned to the internet for unbiased advice, asking if it was truly horrible of me to refuse to fund my half-sibling's education, given the family's history. Shortly thereafter, I spoke to my uncle and confronted him for sharing personal details about my life and success without my approval. He apologized profusely, swearing he had no idea my mother was in such bad shape financially and wouldn't have opened his mouth if he'd known. While I felt betrayed, I also understood his intentions weren't sinister. This is the same man who stood by me when nobody else would, co-signing my loan so I could continue college. That's not something I can easily forget. We came to a workable understanding. I told him clearly that he'd overstepped by telling my mother about my recent accomplishments. He owned up to it, and we managed to settle things. I'm not going to cut him off. I also updated my grandparents, who let me know they believe I'm in the right. They still want a relationship with my mother for the twins' sake, but they think she's crossed a line by harassing me for money. They said they would try talking to her about it. In the following days, my mother started firing off emails listing every tiny thing she'd ever done for me, presumably aiming to guilt-trip me into thinking I owed her a lifetime debt. I guess she hoped this would make me cave in and pay her. The irony is that by law, she had been required to provide for me when I was a minor, so I didn't see how that was some colossal favor. More to the point, she only supported me up to the point where it was convenient for her, then cast me aside so her new family would have more funds and time. Now that the twins are older, and we're all living in the future they used to talk about, I see no reason why I should be stuck covering their bills. At first, I ignored her spam-like messages, but eventually, I wrote back, pointing out precisely that. She held more accusations of ingratitude and disrespect, so I blocked her email. She created new ones to keep pestering me, and I blocked those too. It felt exhausting, but also oddly liberating, an affirmation that I was done holding out hope for a parent who didn't want to be one. If nothing else, this confrontation made it crystal clear that she hadn't changed at all. She then crossed another line by showing up at my workplace unannounced. Luckily, I'd stayed home sick that day, so I wasn't even on the premises. The receptionist called me, obviously alarmed that a woman was making a scene, demanding to see me. When I got on the phone with my mother, I warned her that if she made a huge fuss, I would not hesitate to bring a lawsuit against her, and so would my employer if her behavior disrupted business. I laid it on thick, trying to sound as intimidating as I could. It worked, because she agreed to leave, though she tried to insist I meet her somewhere else. I made it clear she was in no position to negotiate, after what she had put me through. She finally stormed out. That incident was terrifying, and I immediately reached out to a lawyer to discuss whether I could pursue something like a restraining order. Even though she hadn't threatened me overtly, she was undeniably a loose cannon. Then it escalated to the worst point imaginable. Not long after, I came home from work to find her loitering outside my door. I told her plainly that I wasn't in the mood for a blow-up, and would call the police if she didn't leave. She lunged at me anyway, tackling me onto the ground, clawing and striking me while shouting expletives, and blaming me for all her misfortunes. I was momentarily paralyzed by shock at how deranged this was. Eventually, I fought back, managing to break her grip. Neighbors heard the chaos, intervened, and alerted the police. When the officers arrived, I pressed charges without hesitation. Since I wasn't badly hurt, she ended up charged with a misdemeanor, but the entire episode left me shaken to the core. My lawyer is assisting me with obtaining a restraining order. I learned from my grandparents that Harry took the twins and bolted to stay with his own relatives. Apparently, he bailed my mother out and then confronted her, saying she had stepped far beyond normal behavior. She lashed out at him, too. It seems she had snapped from the strain of financial ruin, plus the knowledge that I was thriving. I can't find a shred of pity for her, though, because her predicament is entirely her own doing. Watching her unleash all that pent-up fury on me only confirmed there's no salvaging our relationship. She has alienated nearly everyone around her, even her own parents, by lashing out in this frightening way. My grandparents now want nothing to do with her, because she attacked me, and she was also rude and confrontational with them. I feel a touch of sadness. She's my mother, after all, and something is clearly very wrong, but I also feel relieved to be cutting the final thread. I'm in the process of moving to a better home soon, which feels like a fresh start. If she wants to blame me for every unfortunate thing in her life, that's her problem, not mine. I'm done being a target of her mind games and intimidation tactics. She can keep spinning the story however she likes. I refuse to let her drag me down any further.